Prezentacja będzie ciekawa.
Okay, let's start. Hello everyone, I'm Łukasz. I work here at JLabs. And for the past 3 years or so, I've been writing React applications for the living. So today I'm going to be talking about how do I like to test those applications. A few questions from me at the beginning. How many of you are actually using React or have some experience with React? Raise your hands. Oh, that's a lot of people. Okay, and how many of you have experience with testing React? That's oh, I thought that's great. So hopefully you will learn something from my presentation. Okay, a little bit spoiler at the beginning that this talk will be opinionated. Like there are so many different ways and so many different opinions on how to do stuff with React. So yeah, basically I will be showing what works for us and what I think is a good testing practice in general. But I take into account that some of you might not agree with me, and this is completely fine. Like, yeah. Okay, so first let's define what is a good test. A good test runs fast. So ideally, if developer can run his tests simultaneously while he's developing his code, so there's an instant feedback, and yeah, and developer knows right away whenever something breaks. Secondly, it doesn't break too often, and it means that whenever your tests are breaking because of you are refactoring your code or changing implementation details, that means you are most probably testing it wrong. For example, let's say that you have a React component and you are only renaming a prop and your tests are breaking because of that. That test is most probably badly designed. Okay, it's easy to read and understand. So whenever you onboard new developer to the team and he can just jump into the test and understand the code base right away, that's perfect. It actually catches bugs. I think this is actually the most important thing. And there's a good value to effort ratio. So you don't want to spend hours trying to cover this very weird use case which actually never happens. Ideally, if a single test is covering as much as possible. Sit break. Okay, so enough of theory. I personally think that examples are worth more than thousands of explanations. So I created an application, a React application, which I wrote specifically for this presentation. And first I will show you how I would test this application like a year ago and why I think this was a bad approach. And then I will show you how I'm testing it now and why I think this is good. So let's jump into it. By the way, I'm using the Create React app. This is an official build tool for React applications. It's supported by Facebook, and I really like it. I really recommend it. It's very, very nice to use it. Okay, here's the application. As I said, this application is very simple. It's called Simple Sign Up. Like you basically provide an email address. Let's type some random email. You can optionally check this checkbox. It's not required, but let's check it. And after signing up, you are redirected to the thank you page. As simple as that. And there's of course some API request in the background, which basically sends this data to some random backend. Okay. So I think the application is pretty simple. Let's jump into the implementation. So here's the implementation. Let's start with the root component.
Can everyone in the back see the code?
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. I will maybe I can make it a little bit more larger.
Thanks.
Okay, so this is the root of the application. I'm using Redux here. I personally wouldn't use Redux for application of this size, but for this application, I wanted to make it a little bit more complicated, just so I can cover like most common test use cases. Yeah, and then we have browser router, some standard stuff from React Router DOM, and two main components, the sign up and the thank you component, which you've seen previously. So let's jump into the sign up. This is the sign up component, and some of you might be thinking right now, why is this guy still using classes? Like nobody, like hooks are out. So yeah, and don't worry, we will get our hands dirty with hooks as well later. So hopefully you are not triggered about it right now. Okay, let's discuss it. Let's discuss the implementation. Here we have this form component, and there is an input, which basically handles this email value, and we are keeping the state of this input inside of React component. Here it is. But then we are also rendering this constants component, and this component is responsible for this little checkbox. Maybe when I show you this with React debugger, it will be more clear. This is the constants component. It's responsible for rendering and keeping the state of this checkbox. And a little complicated thing about this is that I'm keeping the state of whether this checkbox is selected or not inside of Redux store. I made it on purpose just so I can cover like most common test use cases. Okay, so here's this constants component. There's a checkbox input, and when we change the value of this checkbox, we are basically flipping the state and changing the value inside of Redux store. And we are also showing this constant value, which we also keep inside of Redux. Maybe let me quickly show you this reducer. It's probably here. Yes, and here we have this value I want to receive marketing emails, and it's displaying here. Okay, I think you have a general idea how this application works. So now let's take a break. Okay, so now I will tell you how I would test this component, because this component is definitely worth testing. I will tell you how I would test this component like a year ago, and why I think this was a bad approach. Okay, so the first, like a year ago, my tool of choice was to render this component with a tool like Enzyme. And if you are not familiar with Enzyme, this is a helper library which helps you rendering React stuff to. Yeah, this is a helper for testing React components. And there are two renderers in Enzyme. It's shallow renderer and a mount. Mount is basically mounting component to the DOM, so it behaves like a real component. And shallow renderer, which doesn't render component to the DOM, but gives you back some tools with you can interact with the component. Okay, so in this case, I would definitely use shallow render, because this component is dependent on Redux, and the only thing I'm exporting from this component is this connect helper. Yes, so the first thing I would do with Enzyme, I would definitely want to export this sign-up component. So I will do something like that. And this is the first mistake I've seen developers doing. Like, you should never export stuff just for testing purposes. This component is never used that way, and your tests shouldn't either be using it that way. Yeah, this was the first mistake. The second thing I would do, I would probably shallow render this component and make a snapshot of it. So I would get something like this to my snapshot testing, and then I would compare it to the previous snapshot. And a few words about snapshot testing. I'm not a big fan of them. Like, once I was in a project where we were snapshotting basically everything, and after some time the developers really don't care about snapshots. Like, whenever a new snapshot was coming in and I was reviewing a pull request, I was like, oh fuck it, another snapshot, let's scroll down. So definitely, I'm not saying that snapshot testing is completely useless, but for the components, I don't think that it's worth it. Okay, then with Enzyme, I would want to try to make this component 100% code coverage. So I would want to test those instance methods. And the way to do this in Enzyme, let's pretend that I'm inside a test file. Let's pretend that this chunk of code is just inside a test file. So I would render this component with Enzyme. Something like that. I would be given this wrapper. Sorry. And then I would fire off my instance methods like this. I would provide some test value, and then I would do my expectation. So I would expect that my wrapper dot state dot email, because this value basically sets the state of an email, to be this test. And okay, my test would be passing. I would basically do the same with this handle submit function. And okay, my test would be passing. I would be very happy, like I have 100% code coverage. But then, let's say I made a typo, and instead of handle email change here for the input, I would provide handle submit here. And what happened? My code is completely broken, but my tests are passing. So that's the next lesson. You should never. This is testing implementation details. You should never ever do this. Yeah, I don't recommend doing this because this is not a good testing practice. Like, you should always try to test your stuff as if it's really used. So in this case, you would definitely want to provide this value somehow to this input, and just click the sign up button. That's the way to test it. Okay, I think I have covered like most common errors I made back then. So now let's talk about what I think is a valuable test. Let's go back to the presentation. Okay, we were here. Okay, how to write a good test in React apps. And the first point is that I write mostly integration tests. It might be a little bit controversial, but I just don't unit test my components. Like, my components are never used without its like shallow rendering from Enzyme, which basically doesn't render your components which renders your component without its dependencies. It just doesn't provide value, I think. Yes, and secondly, I never test implementation details, because once you also annoying thing about testing implementation details, once you start it, and whenever you, like, let's say that you have tested you tested some implementation details, and then you wanted to refactor your code. And when you want to refactor your code, you need to refactor your tests as well together with code, which doesn't make sense. Next point would be to don't aim for code coverage, but aim for use case coverage instead. And a few words about that code coverage for applications doesn't prove anything. Code coverage might be good for libraries, but for application, I would measure quality of my tests by the use case coverage, how my application is actually used, and I would test my application this way. Next, I would always recommend you to test your components as if a real user would test it. And I would mock as little as possible, because usually I mock only some external dependencies that that I don't have control over. Okay, I forgot to mention about this integration test that I also like writing end-to-end tests with tools like Puppeteer, or maybe Puppeteer, and the second one was, I can't remember, the Cypress. They are great tools, but once you start having a lot of tests, that they might become cumbersome because they are very heavy, and it might be inconvenient for developers to work with them. Okay, so now the good stuff. Now I will show you how I'm testing my. Now I will show you how I like to test my components. Yeah, basically how I like to test my components. And the first thing I always do. Oh no, sorry, I messed up my. Yeah, sorry. So now there's actually a tool which helps you achieving most of these goals, and this tool is called React Testing Library, and it's a replacement for Enzyme. Like Enzyme has very extensive API, which I think most of Enzyme's API methods you shouldn't even use, because it encourages testing implementation details. And React Testing Library actually encourages good testing practices. It's very good for integration testing. It's actually recommended by the Facebook team. You can read about this inside the React docs. And I was surprised, but because when I was creating this demo, this application, and I used Create React App, it was actually included by default in here. So that's actually amazing. Okay, so let's get back to the code. And now I will show you how I like to test my code now. So the first thing I do in new applications is I write this render method. This is my custom render method, which might be different for specific applications. And it looks a little bit scary at the beginning, but believe me, it's really simple. So this method accepts a node, which is basically a component we want to render. And I'm rendering this component with all of my providers. So this ensures that my component is actually rendered in test as if it would be rendered inside the browser. And I can fire a real user event on it. So that's perfect. Maybe let's discuss those options, those optional options. And the first option is root, and we are using it specifically for the router, for the history object, which we are passing to the router, because there might be some situations when we want to simulate that we are on specific route, and we want to basically check if everything renders correctly. Okay, next we have initial state, and this is specifically for Redux. So sometimes we want to initialize, before rendering, we want to initialize the store with specific values. It might be very useful sometimes. And then we are returning an object, which basically, those are some helpers methods. I will show you in tests how to use them, why they are useful basically. But all you need to know, the most important thing about it is that this render method basically mounts component to the DOM, and it behaves as if it was really inside our application. So let's go to the tests. This is the sign up test. I would okay, so how I would test it. The first thing I would do is to provide some to write this before each callback, which basically will be mocking my fetch call. So I don't want my external dependencies to bother my tests. So I'm assuming that whenever I call fetch, it basically resolves promise, and it basically, yeah, it tells you that you can go on and everything is okay. It returns some simple JSON. And I'm clearing this mock just for, yeah, just so it's not, so it doesn't bother other tests. Okay, here are some helper methods. I will discuss them later. And this is the first actual test. So I want to test if my component is sending proper data. So the first thing I do, I'm using my render helper, which is specifically for this application. So my component is rendered as if it was rendered inside a real application. I'm rendering it with root provider just so it behaves exactly the same as I'm using it inside my root component. And I'm providing some Redux state. This is the use case when you would want to like preload your state with some data. And then the good stuff happens. I'm calling this fill the form helper method. I wrote them just so I don't repeat myself, because there are some situations where I want to fire them in other tests. And what it does, I'm just behaving as if I was a user, a real user. So I'm using this screen helper, which is a utility method from the React testing library. And you can think of it as a method as an object which helps you querying the DOM. So I'm grabbing the label of the component. I'm grabbing of an input, which is email. The most important thing about this is I'm testing as if I was a user. So I'm grabbing the email and I'm firing an event change. I'm firing it on this email input, and I'm providing some sample value, which is just this test.email. Okay, the next step, I'm grabbing this consent exactly as if a user would do this. I'm clicking on this consent, I'm submitting the form, and I'm expecting that my mock will be called with proper values. Maybe let's run those tests. Woohoo! My tests are broken. Oh, it's perfect, and it's really good that they are breaking, because I made a change previously. I made a typo previously here. So let's fix it first. Okay, they are passing. Okay, let's say that I want to break this test to see if it's providing real value to the project. So let's go back here, and let's say that when I'm sending the data, I forgot to send this email. And it's breaking really nicely. Okay, the next test is that I want to assert that this component is redirecting me to the thank you page after I send the data. So I basically do the same stuff, but this time I'm grabbing this history object, which this render method is returning. I'm doing the standard stuff as before. I'm filling the form, I'm submitting the form. Here I need to use this wait helper, which basically waits until this promise is resolved. And after
how is checking that it's resolved? Sorry for
it's basically waiting until the next tick of JavaScript.
It waits like 300 milliseconds by default. It's not waiting until the next tick.
Oh, sorry. You might be probably, yeah. shout out to you.
You can also pass like lambda inside this function, and it will rerun this function until the assertion inside the function will pass.
Yes, there are some also additional stuff from React Testing Library which helps you to achieve this. Okay, so then I'm doing my expectation with my history object, and yeah, and I'm certain that I'm on the thank you page. Let's intentionally break this test and make a typo here. And it's breaking really nicely. Okay, and the last test is about displaying an error when the request fails. So here I'm overwriting this fetch callback. And I'm basically telling my fetch to reject value. So it basically go to this catch block and sets the error. It sets the state with error. And after this state is called, we are rendering this error component, which basically says something went wrong. Okay, so standard stuff. I'm rendering, I'm filling the form, I'm submitting the form, I'm waiting until my promise is resolved, and then I'm expecting, as if a real user would expect it, that something is wrong is inside the document. That's it. Okay, so one more thing I want to show you, because I promised you hooks. And as you can see, this is a class component. So I have a nice meme about this, which always makes me smile. I hate thinking about this in JavaScript. Okay, so I have refactored version of it on another branch. Boom, everything is refactored with hooks. And believe me or not, but I haven't changed my tests at all, and that's the great thing about it. Like, my tests are still the same. I didn't need to refactor them. And just to confirm, they are still passing, and I think this is one of the great thing about this. Okay, that will be it. Thank you very much. This talk was highly inspired by this guy, Kenzie Dots. I really recommend checking him out, checking his content, his blog post, and other stuff. And if you are interested in checking out this demo, it's available on my GitHub account.
Łukasz, do you let them ask some questions?
Yeah, definitely. If you, are there any questions?
Maybe first of all, thank you. Successfully.
Hopefully it wasn't confusing. That this was my first presentation, and hopefully it wasn't that much confusing. But yeah.
So thanks guys, thanks Łukasz. So